This week, our portion is called Beshalach, and the title is Live Freely. This is a verse from Shemot 14:31. And Israel saw the great power that the Lord exercised against the Egyptians, and the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and Moses, his servant. This verse is so profound that it made me think of the development of emunah, faith, in our lives. If we step back a little as we read this portion, Beshalach, which means when released or sent, we witness the birth of a nation that had lost its identity and personality. Now, I'm speaking for Mauricio, who wrote this message, when he says, I have children who have suffered. I have known children who have suffered physical and emotional abuse. It changed their personalities. And when I saw them years later, I wondered what happened to that happy and communicative child. Constant abuse has changed their reality. Egypt, and specifically Pharaoh, had for decades continuously abused the Israelites, which greatly affected their mindsets. According to certain academics, aggression causes various effects in human beings. According to Seligman, aggression is reproduced in others. We see this in Moses when he took justice into his own hands. He saw an Israelite being attacked and went to defend him, resulting in the Egyptian being killed. We read that in Shemot 2, verses 11 and 12. Now, according to Bandura, aggression results in depression/anxiety, generating a complex social cycle learned through observation and transmitted to others. We then see how the Israelites constantly complained about the lack of water, the lack of meat, and they were going around in circles, etc. When we evaluate the stories of the Exodus, we see how slavery affected normal and healthy people, and how the lives of these people, and that it did not make better people by criticizing them for how they behaved in threatening situations. I can see certain traits in this portion, responses to real situations that instill fear, if not terror. For example, in Shemot 14:10, the Israelites see Pharaoh. He's the aggressor. They're camping behind them, and it causes them stress, and they immediately complained to Moses. Did you bring us here because there were no graves in Egypt to die in the desert? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? The response didn't come from nowhere. According to UNAM researcher Francisco Sotres, it was a response to a stimulus from the past, whether real or imaginary, and it produced emotions that could not be controlled and generated a behavioral, physiological, and survival response. If we understand a little about the complex body created by the Eternal that we read in Bereshit, we realize that he instilled survival mechanisms within us, and that dangerous situations produce adrenaline and cortisol, causing sugar to be released into the muscles so that we are able to escape, hide, or face danger. This stress can cause reactions such as muscle contraction. What's the danger of this type of response? It is living in a chronic state of fear, stress, anxiety, or as Sotres mentions, a state of continuous emergency, because they bring consequences such as ulcer, trauma, or mental disorders, even when a real threat no longer exists. For example, let's say I was assaulted in a park. This generates a physiological and behavioral reaction. Now, what would be the problem? Every time I would pass through a park or a similar place, a fear would overtake me causing the same reaction as that original traumatic event. It seems that the Eternal, in the process of growing us up as a nation, was placing Israel in uncomfortable situations in which they had to relive certain traumas so that they could overcome generational fears with their corresponding responses to these stimuli so that they could be free once and for all. Here's an example. In 1991, El Salvador had recently emerged from a war, and I had the opportunity at that time to travel to the United States for the first time. As a child, I had learned that a bang, that sound bang, was equivalent to a bullet, and we had to run and take shelter. Now I arrived in Miami for a school camp when suddenly a tire from a car burst with a loud bang. My first reaction was to throw myself onto the ground. Sweating, I covered my head and looked for a place to escape. The children from other countries and the Americans just stared at me. For them, there was no stimulus to that specific noise of a bang. But for me, there was stimulus that had been caused by the Civil War. What was the difference between them and me? The thing is that they had lived free from a civil war, and I had been a slave to one. I saw on this occasion that to be free, we must free ourselves from fears. King David knew this. He had lived with many fears in his life. He had to face Saul, Abimelech, and many enemies who sought his death. He wrote in Tehillim 34, 5-7, and verse 10, I sought the Lord, and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces shall not be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard and saved him from all his troubles. Fear the Lord, you pious ones, for those who fear him will have no want. When I read this psalm, I said David could imagine the human responses to the stimuli that generate fear in us: terror, shame, anguish, and the fear of scarcity. Based on these, we can see them in this portion. In 14:12, we read, leave us alone to serve the Egyptians, for it's better for us to have served the Egyptians than to die in the desert. The response to a stimulus that causes terror is the fear of dying in the desert. Then we read in chapter 15, verses 22-23, and Moses led the children of Israel out of the Sea of Reeds, and they went out into the wilderness of Shear, and they walked 3 days to the desert and found no water. And they came to Marah, but they could not drink water from Marah because it was bitter. What was the stimulus? Distress, the distress that came from not being able to drink water. Later in chapter 16, verse 3, and the children of Israel said to them, if only we had died at the hands of the Lord in the land of Egypt, where we sat by a pot of meat and we had plenty of bread to eat, because you have brought us out into this desert to kill us. Here, what was the stimulus? Fear of shortage, even though it was imaginary, because they had left Egypt with a lot of cattle. We read that in Exodus chapter 12, verse 38. And finally, in chapter 17, verse 8, we see how the Amalekites try to embarrass Israel in a senseless attack. And Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. These people wanted to boost their own morale. While meditating upon it, I observed that sometimes the Eternal allows certain traumas to occur in our lives. They provoke in us terror, fear, shame, or anguish to such an extent that if we do not fear ourselves from these traumas, our health and well-being can deteriorate. not only personally, but at the family, community, and social levels. In the same portion, we see that the Eternal sent the remedies, the medicines for each specific situation. What was the remedy for terror? There were three. First, faith, emunah, that the Eternal gives to each of us. He cares for each of us and he fights for us, as we read in chapter 14, verse 14. Second, he teaches us that to exercise our emunah, we need to turn it to bitachon, to trust, by walking into the unknown. In chapter 14, 15, he says, speak to the children of Israel and tell them to go. They were going into the unknown. And third, we must observe God's salvation and show gratitude for it at every moment. We read in chapter 14:31, and Israel saw the great power that the Eternal exercised against the Egyptians. And this was followed by the song of Moses and the children of Israel in chapter 15. And what was the remedy, the cure for heartbreak? He says in chapter 15, verse 26, there God imposed upon the people mishpatim and chukim, statutes and judgments, and there he tested them. And he said, if you will listen attentively to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, then I will not send upon you any of the diseases that I had sent upon the Egyptians. If the Torah is continually before us, we will not be afraid. We will not live in distress. As Psalms 119:92 says, if your Torah were not my occupation, then I would have perished in my affliction. What was the remedy for the fear of scarcity? The Shabbat and the manna, or in Hebrew, man, are equivalent to obedience to the voice of the Eternal. The immediate response was not to send quails, but it followed their complaint. In chapter 16, verse 4, we read, and the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread upon you from heaven, and the people will go out and gather a day's portion every day, so that I may test whether they walk in my Torah or not. The manna or man reminds us that we receive everything from heaven. If we have this faith that everything comes to us from heavens, we will be able to overcome the anxiety generated by a perceived shortage. Also, he teaches us that we should not live to accumulate, rather that we should live with our daily portion, which is enough. And third, on Shabbat, chapter 16, verse 5, a double portion was gathered, and it miraculously didn't spoil. It didn't rot. That is, we live confidently that God will provide for Shabbat, and we must rest in him. Finally, how do we deal with and face shame? In chapter 17, verses 9 to 10, it says, and Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us and go out to fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill, and the rod of God will be in my hand. And Joshua did as Moses told him, and he fought against Amalek. It's interesting that Amalek does not disappear, but appears from generation to generation in different forms, because he said the Eternal will war against Amalek from generation to generation. When Amalek is weakened, it hides, it disappears. 17, verse 13, for a time, but it is not eliminated. So we must know that at some point, this evil will return. The first Amalek to destroy is our low self-esteem, caused by being ashamed of who we are and what our beliefs produce in us. But then it is the shame caused by external agents. Unlike the court at The Hague that ruled that we cannot use Torah, specifically referring to this portion, we must understand that sinat chinam, gratuitous or free hatred, must be destroyed. Senseless hatred, generating evil and shame for the pleasures of others who inflicted. We must not tolerate evil against God's creation simply for our pleasure, because it is equivalent to fueling the spirit of Amalek in the world. We must face it and stop it and eliminate it, even if others do not understand it. Do you want to live as a free person? Do you want to stop being a slave to some traumatic event from your past? You must openly decide today to activate your emunah, your faith, by turning it to bitachon, trust, to fight against evil, to daily give thanks, to obey God's judgments and statutes, to welcome the manna, the man, the heavenly bread, by keeping Shabbat. Job 22:28 says, you will make a decision, and it will be fulfilled for you, and light will shine in all your ways. Decide today that you will do whatever it takes to free yourself from your fears, to revere the eternal, and to trust in him. Shabbat Shalom.